Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, finally, I'm talking about the debut album from The Orb. The Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. Alright, this has been a long time coming. We're finally getting into the next discography review, and what I've been promising would be a thing for, I think, more than half the time this channel's even been around. And it's a big one. We're talking about one of my all-time favorite ambient outfits, The Orb. Originally formed in 1988 as the duo of Alex Patterson and Jimmy Cauty, they had been working on a debut album together called Space before the latter decided to break off The Orb entirely and just release that project as a solo album, as I went over in my video on the KLF. If you missed that one, then I'll put a card up there. But Patterson obviously had much bigger plans for The Orb than simply being a side project for the KLF. So he assembled a huge lineup of collaborators to form a similarly space-themed project that sprawled on for nearly 2 hours total, and basically kicked off the entire genre of ambient house. Now, I've already made it no secret what I think of this project. Back in 2016, I marked it as my number 13 favorite album of all time, and yeah, I still hold it up that highly to this day. It may not have been the first Orb album I listened to in full. That honor goes to Orbis Terrarum, which I've already done a video on and I've explained my somewhat more complicated history with. But the track Little Fluffy Clouds, specifically the version from this album, was my first exposure to the Orb at all. I first heard it in middle school as like a loose track included on an iTunes Essentials playlist. And obviously, having been a longtime Orbital fan, I kind of already wanted to get into this other band that came from the same era and scene with a very similar name. Though I also may have been slightly intimidated by the fact that the album this track came from was so gigantic and sprawling and had most of its tracks marked on iTunes as album only, because that's what iTunes does for any tracks longer than 10 minutes. Little Fluffy Clouds did become a quick favorite of mine anyway, and it being my only exposure to them probably contributed to Orbis Terrarum, especially throwing me off when I finally got to hear that, and leading to me not investigating the Orb further until high school, once my taste in ambient music had been expanded further, and I figured out how to properly digest this kind of material. But once I did get to hear the Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld in its full 2-hour glory, I loved all of it immediately, and had kinda wished it had been my actual starting point. And it is undoubtedly what I would most recommend as the starting point for anyone looking to get into the Orb for the first time. I admittedly don't know if it would have been my thing had I attempted to get into it in those early days of being an electronic music fan who didn't know how to digest ambient music yet, but I suspect it would have helped me get into this kind of material faster as well. I don't know. Whatever the case, it is still a project that I hold very close to me and became very formative to my tastes in ambient music and ambient house and whatever else. This project really takes you on a journey that isn't quite matched by any other project that I know of, that feels like it starts on Earth but launches out into the outer reaches of the galaxy and beyond. A sprawling experience that has lots of very long tracks that may not have a ton of progression over time, but manage to both capture the vast openness of space with their structuring, as well as managing to keep me invested from start to finish in spite of that. There's not a single moment on this project that feels like it doesn't feel really important and meaningful to the overall experience. And as great as the more laid-back ambient moments are, a lot of this album really bangs as well. Like, this project has a lot of excellent dub grooves throughout that really helped inform my taste in that genre. There's plenty of variety here, with nearly every track here featuring a different collaborator who had their own unique spin to the spacey sounds of the project. Patterson is the only one present on every track, and the only person with input on every Orb project throughout the decades. He's basically the mastermind behind the Orb as a whole, though from what I've heard he doesn't tend to contribute much to these projects purely on a musical or instrumental level. He doesn't play any instruments and tends to act more in the role of like a film director, like everything is still his vision but he's not playing most of it. But that's not to say he makes no musical contributions at all. He is known to be adept with sampling. Like, a big part of the Orb sound is Patterson adding random snippets of narration or news broadcasts or that kind of thing. It's a really obvious signature element that appears on nearly all of their albums and an integral part of what makes the Orb what they are. But on top of that, there are plenty of Orb tracks composed primarily out of samples. Little Fluffy Clouds is one such example. It's got an originally recorded bass line and synth riff, presumably contributions from Martin Glover, aka Youth, who's another collaborator who appears on a whole bunch of different Orb albums. But it's also characterized by several different narrated samples from the BBC, a harmonica intro from an Ennio Morricone composition, and most notably a clip from an interview with singer Rickie Lee Jones, in which he recounts what the sky looked like when she was young and lived out in Arizona, from which the title is derived. Also featuring and all being brought together by an absolutely banging drum break taken from Jump Into the Fire by Harry Nilsson, and a plucky acoustic guitar hook taken from Steve Reich's Electric Counterpoint. Now, since this was the early 90s before record companies cracked down on anyone who used samples, Patterson and Youth put the track out before a lot of these samples were even cleared and it became a hit. And the samples had somewhat mixed responses by their original owners. Like, Steve Reich, for instance, apparently really liked the track, and was flattered that his composition was flipped into this different context and made the main hook. He even specifically requested his record company not sue them on his behalf. Though they did ask for a cut, like, about a decade later. Rickie Lee Jones, on the other hand, was not at all happy with their use of her voice and the way they made her sound like she was on drugs, and did properly sue them shortly after the track was released, though they settled out of court on that one to keep the sample in. And that would be far from the last time the Orb would have legal troubles. Now, obviously, Little Fluffy Clouds has gone on to become the Orb's single most easily recognizable track, and being my first ever exposure to them, it's still one of my personal favorite moments from them overall, too. And that's not even getting into how epic this track can get in live sets when it gets expanded out. I went and saw these guys live while they were touring for No Sounds or Out of Bounds, and they closed their set with like a 20-minute version of this track, and it was pretty awesome. But in the context of this album, it's just a quick 4.5-minute cut and practically just acts as an album intro. From this point on, the album upscales quickly, and you will not see another track that runs on any shorter than 8 minutes. If Little Fluffy Clouds took place in the Earth's atmosphere, Earth Gaia is where you get sent into Earth's orbit. Earth Orbit is the name of the entire first side of the album, by the way. Anyway, this track is mostly the brainchild of Chris Weston, aka Thrash, a recording engineer and musician who handled a lot of the mixing and mastering on this album, would go on to collaborate with the Orb much more closely on their next 2 albums, and a lot of people will tell you was the Orb's true greatest talent. This particular track is one of the darkest and roughest sounding moments on here. A lot of edgy, wavering bass lines and filtered sounds somewhere between guitars and synths, thumping dub beats, various experimental analog synth effects, samples from Bible readings and Flash Gordon. Sounds great, has a real portentous feeling to it. Though I don't even really consider this to be one of the better tracks on the album. Most of the other tracks here either have even stronger atmosphere or grooves than those on display here. Where this album really starts to take off into outer space is the third cut, the 11-minute Supernova at the End of the Universe. This one's a collab with System 7, aka Steve Hillage and Miket Girardi, who would go on to become regular Orb collaborators as well. This one literally starts with a rocket blasting off, and you get immersed in a mix of wavering synth patterns, eerie MIDI choirs, a menagerie of NASA samples talking about translunar injection burners and that kind of thing, and of course one absolutely banging hip-hop beat that runs through most of it, and one pretty nice digression in the second half with like a deeper bass line and that one kind of yelpy vocal sample, I guess. The entire mix of ambient effects and NASA samples this track explores is also reprised on the following track that begins the lunar orbit side, Backside of the Moon. Heck, these 2 tracks are basically identical, with Backside of the Moon taking out all the percussion, aside from one loop of tapping congas, also stretching on 3 minutes longer and with even less progression over time. This track is probably my least favorite cut here, since it comes the closest to being outright redundant. I do much prefer Supernova, since it has both the immersive atmosphere, along with being a total banger that happens to evolve more over time. But after so many years of listening to this album, I also can't say I ever feel the urge to skip this ambient version, or think the album would benefit from having it cut out altogether. Like, Backside of the Moon does let all of these sounds, get better space to breathe, and it's certainly well-textured and immersive enough to still keep my attention despite how long-winded and seemingly unchanging it is. I've seen a lot of people say they prefer this cut over Supernova, and I can definitely understand that. But when it comes to these kinds of simplistic, monolithic ambient pieces stretching on for 14-15 minutes, I'm a bit more of a fan of Spanish Castles in Space. This track, a collab with bassist Guy Pratt, Andy Falconer, and Jake Le Mesurier, who I think handles the drumming, but I'm not sure. But yeah, this one's actually much sparser and emptier, and probably has less to it than Backside of the Moon. But the way it combines these very slow-moving bass line, tapping cymbal sounds, light jazz piano samples, some Russian narration that borders on ASMR. It's basically like one giant lonely lullaby and makes great use of its stripped-back minimalism for very strong emotional effects. I mean, barely anything happens over the course of those 15 minutes, but it still had me absolutely captivated from beginning to end. I still love it. It's one of my favorites. Now, if these long-winded ambient cuts had you hankering for something with a bit more of a groove, we then move into the Ultraworld probe side, where we get a few more bangers. Starting off with Perpetual Dawn, another pretty easily recognizable single of theirs, which is a collab with pirate radio DJ Eddie Maiden. This one's just a super straightforward dub reggae cut featuring all number of samples of evil laughing and weird vocalizations. And flute riffs, too. Just plods along for 9.5 minutes, but that groove is good enough to make that time just seem to zip by. But as much of a classic as that track is, then we get into the Fourth Dimension, which is probably the single coolest sounding cut in the bunch. Primarily the work of Andy Falconer with some help from Killing Joke drummer Paul Ferguson. This one features lots of cascades of synth effects going over this intro of a full choir performance of Gregorio Allegri's Miserere, and some woman narrating like individual words in Spanish. I freaking love this intro so much. And it leads right into this continually evolving cut of, like, acid-tinged trance, I guess, that just thumps along and even includes a full sample from a Vivaldi violin concerto. There's also that huge triumphant section of synth chords somewhere in the middle, too. Like, in contrast to all these other tracks that tend to mostly focus on the same kinds of ideas through their entire running time, Into the Fourth Dimension just keeps you guessing on where it's gonna go next. But every sound fits in the mix perfectly and really evokes that feeling of being transported into some other section of the universe light years away. If I'm in the right mood, this could even beat out Little Fluffy Clouds as my favorite cut in the bunch. And that track is followed by one last banger in Outlands. This is a collab with Thomas Fellman, who would probably go on to be the most frequent full-time Orb collaborator of all. This one's got a much spookier and heavier feel to it. Loads of banging hip-hop samples, a wobbling earworm of a bass line, little barely present funk guitar licks, a haunting sample of Kraftwerk's Europe Endless that seems obvious in retrospect, but I didn't even realize was a sample for years. Some more samples from that Ricky Lee Jones interview, too, that are a lot less intelligible than the ones from Little Fluffy Clouds. Also has a pretty cool intro of, like, rain and other sound effects in the beginning, and some other stuff that comes and goes. Shouting DJs, too. Well, I suppose this isn't as big a favorite as Perpetual Dawn or Into the Fourth Dimension. It still absolutely freaking kicks ass. And then for the end of this album, we got two more laid-back ambient-centric cuts for the Ultraworld side. Star 6 and 789, a collab with Tom Green and Hugh Vickers, is a beautiful collection of sparkling synth guitar plucking, possibly showing some influence from Steve Reich's Electric Counterpoint again, though not directly sampling it this time. There's loads of soothing synth choirs, field recordings with twittering birds, later this deep and round bass line that gets introduced, and more barely present narrators all over the place. It feels like we've touched down on another planet in some other part of the universe that happens to have life not unlike that on Earth, but without, humans to ruin everything. It's just such a refreshing, peaceful, and uplifting moment for this project. Another one of my biggest favorites. But that finally brings us to the closer. The humongous and humongously titled 18-minute monster, a huge, ever-growing, pulsating brain that rules from the center of the Ultraworld, Live Mix Mark 10. Well, this technically wasn't the first Orb track ever made. It was the genesis of the Orb we know and love today. The only Orb track still hailing from the days where Jimmy Cauty was a member, based around one constantly repeating synth progression, I believe pulled from Grace Jones' Slave to the Rhythm, and featuring fairly liberal samples of Minnie Riperton's Loving You, alongside lots of other synths, field recordings, chopped up choirs, other various sound effects. And it just continually builds up and down before eventually slowing down right at the end and just kind of fading out into ocean sound effects. I will have to admit that I actually don't consider this track one of my big personal favorites from here. Like, it's the only track here where I feel like the length maybe gets a bit much. While there are plenty of digressions into other sounds and enough sonic variety to justify the 18-minute length, these digressions never feel like they last for long enough to feel like they amount to the track actually going somewhere. That main synth progression is always ready to come back again in full force a few seconds after it goes away. It's not the most consistently engaging piece the Orb have ever come up with, but it is still a classic track, and one heck of a showstopper finale to this album all the same. Feels like the logical extreme that this project deserved to finish on, and I do still love it. Like those core Grace Jones and Minnie Riperton samples. They will forever belong to the Orb, in my mind. And I've also heard live versions of this track that I think are even better. I know they had one in like a Peel session or something that went on for 20 minutes, but included even stronger beats, and even some guitar samples from Pink Floyd's Shine On You Crazy Diamond for good measure. But, yeah, that's something else. And yeah, that's every track on The Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. So yeah, overall, I don't really have words for how consistently this project still floors me to this day. Not to say I think it's absolutely wall-to-wall perfect. Like I said, there are moments that drag, there are tracks I find to be underwhelming in comparison to others. And the way that these tracks all stretch on so long without a ton in the way of progression, I can definitely understand if it got to some people and turned them off. There's certainly plenty of other much sonically denser ambient projects out there, even elsewhere in the Orb's catalog. But the length of this one has never once bothered me. All these mixes are really captivating in their own right and never get old to me. Hell, if anything, an album like this may have done more to contribute to my preference towards longer-winded albums in general, in comparison with most people. I mean, who cares about being a tight listening experience when you can have an album like this that makes 110 minutes zip by as if it were nothing? So long as you can keep me interested the whole time, then I don't care about album lengths. And Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld is one of the easiest go-to examples of that. Every track feels like a big important moment, all of them have stunning spacey atmosphere or at least some great banging grooves that can keep me captivated on their own. It's an absolute freaking classic, still one of my favorites of all time and one of my most listened to albums, period. And while I still think The Orb have plenty of other great projects that I think are worth people's time, this will forever be their masterpiece, and I'm overall feeling a 9.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.